Look at Malaysia on a map, and it looks like it shouldn't exist the way it does. Two separate pieces of land, split by more than 400 miles of open sea, somehow belonging to the same country. One half sits on a peninsula hanging off mainland Asia. The other half sits on an island it shares with two completely different nations. No land bridge connects them. No visible thread ties them together. But peel back the water. Not metaphorically. Literally drain the sea between them, the way it actually was drained more than once over the last 100,000 years. And something strange happens. The two halves of Malaysia touch. They were never really separate at all. They were pieces of a single enormous landmass, a place that doesn't appear on any modern map because it isn't there anymore. Geologists have a name for it. Most people have never heard of it. And what happened to it explains almost everything strange about Malaysia. Why its mountains are still growing, why its rainforest is older than the Amazon, why its caves hide the largest empty space ever found underground, and why one of its islands sits stranded in open ocean, hundreds of miles from anything. This is the story of a country built, quite literally, on the bones of a lost world. Fact number 10. Malaysia and the Lost Continent. Here's the thing about the word continent. It sounds absolute, solid, permanent. But continents are not permanent. They're paperwork, lines we draw around land that happens to be above water at this particular moment in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. Change the water level, and the paperwork changes with it. That's exactly what happened here. Around 20,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age, so much of Earth's water was locked up in glaciers that global sea levels sat roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. And in Southeast Asia, that drop in sea level exposed something enormous. Geologists call it sun-dew land. Picture the shallow seafloor stretching between the Malay Peninsula, the island of Sumatra, the island of Borneo, and the island of Java. Most of that seafloor is shallow. Geologically speaking, embarrassingly shallow, less than 200 meters deep in most places. It's part of what's known as the Sunda Shelf, the submerged edge of the Southeast Asian continental plate. And when the ice ages pulled the ocean back, that shallow shelf didn't stay underwater. It came up for air. What emerged wasn't a scattering of islands. It was one continuous landmass, roughly the size of India, stitching together land that today belongs to Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and parts of Thailand. Rivers that now empty separately into the sea once flowed together across dry ground, joining into a single river system running through the heart of sun-dew land before finally reaching the ocean far to the south. Animals walked between what are now separate islands. Early humans did too. So when people say Malaysia sits on a lost continent, that's not quite the full picture. And it's worth being precise about it, because the real story is stranger than the shorthand. Sun-dew land wasn't a separate tectonic continent that broke off and vanished the way, say, a piece of ancient Gondwana did. It's better described as a drowned landmass, a huge, biologically unified region that existed above sea level for tens of thousands of years, and then didn't. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. That drowning wasn't a single event. It happened in stages, as the ice sheets melted unevenly, and one particular period, around 14,000 years ago, saw sea levels rise so fast that scientists have nicknamed it Meltwater Pulse 1A. In under 500 years, sea levels may have jumped by as much as 16 meters, not over millennia, over centuries. If you were a person living on the Sunda Shelf during that window, the coastline you knew as a child would have been unrecognizable by the time you were old. Entire river valleys, entire hunting grounds, entire pieces of the world people called home went under the sea within a handful of generations. How do scientists know any of this actually happened rather than just inferring it from the shape of the ocean floor? A few different lines of evidence line up. Sonar mapping of the seafloor between Malaysia, Sumatra, and Borneo has revealed the outlines of ancient river channels, dry land drainage systems, now submerged, that only make sense if that seabed used to be exposed land. Sediment cores pulled from the South China Sea contain pollen and plant material from species that only grow on dry ground, buried in layers that date to exactly the period when sun-dew land should have existed. And the biology backs it up too. Species of monkeys, elephants, and plants found on Borneo, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula are close enough genetically that they clearly shared a common population within the last few tens of thousands of years, which simply isn't possible unless those landmasses were connected. So what does modern Malaysia have to do with any of this? Everything, really. Peninsular Malaysia was the high, dry backbone of sun-dew land, one of the parts that never fully submerged even in earlier warm periods, which is part of why it has some of the oldest continuously existing rainforest on the planet. Land that in some form has never been fully cleared or fully drowned in over 100 million years. And East Malaysia, the states of Sabah and Sarawak on the island of Borneo, sat on the eastern edge of the same shelf, connected to the peninsula by dry land that today is simply gone, replaced by the South China Sea, which means the strange split geography of modern Malaysia, one country, two landmasses, hundreds of miles of ocean between them, isn't some historical accident of colonial border drawing. It's the leftover shape of a much older, much larger country of nature's own making, one that the rising ocean quietly erased. And that raises an obvious question. If the land between Malaysia's two halves is gone, is there anything left to prove it was ever there at all? Anything you could actually point to today? There is, and it's not hidden under the sea. Some of it is standing in plain sight, still rising out of the ground as we speak. Fact 9. A country literally split in two. Most countries that span more than one landmass are made up of islands close enough to feel like a single territory. Cluster a chain, something you could plausibly sail between in an afternoon. Malaysia isn't like that. Peninsular Malaysia, East Malaysia, separated by roughly 600 kilometers of open sea. To put that in perspective, that's further than the distance from London to Berlin. And in between those two halves of the same country sits not just water, but the sovereign territory of two other nations, Brunei, Indonesia. This isn't a minor administrative curiosity, it shapes daily life. Getting from Kuala Lumpur, Ku O Ching Kota Kinabalu, means flying or taking a multi-day sea journey. There's no road, no rail, no bridge. Malaysians even use different terminology for it. Crossing from one half of the country to the other is often referred to, informally, as going back to the mainland. They feel like two places that happen to share a government. And this is precisely the fingerprint Sun-dew land left behind. Before the flooding, someone standing where the South China Sea is today wouldn't have been standing in the sea at all. They'd have been standing on a plain walking distance, in geological terms, from both what's now Peninsular Malaysia and what's now Borneo. The ocean that divides the country today is, quite literally, the missing piece of the puzzle from Fact 10. It's not that Malaysia was built oddly. It's that the ground it was built on partially disappeared. But not all of it disappeared. Some of Sun-dew land's highest points never went under the water at all. They're still standing. And one of them is doing something a mountain really isn't supposed to do. Fact 8. The mountain that refuses to stop growing. Most of the world's great mountains are ancient. The Appalachians are roughly 480 million years old. Even the comparatively young Alps have been rising for around 30 million years. Mountains, on a human timescale, are supposed to be finished projects. Monuments, not works in progress. Mount Kinabalu in Sabah didn't get the memo. At just over 4,000 meters, Kinabalu is the highest peak in Malaysia and one of the highest in all of Southeast Asia. But its real claim to strangeness isn't its height, it's its age. Kinabalu is made of granite that solidified from molten rock a mere 10 to 12 million years ago, making it one of the youngest non-volcanic granite mountains on Earth. For comparison, that's roughly the same age as some of the early ancestors of modern elephants. In mountain years, Kinabalu is practically a newborn, and it's still growing. GPS measurements have shown the mountain rising by roughly 5 millimeters a year, pushed upward as it cools tectonic pressure from the Australian plate, tectonic pressure from the Sunda plate. 5 millimeters doesn't sound dramatic, until you realize that over the roughly 6 million years since the mountain first pushed above the surrounding landscape, that slow, patient growth has been enough to build one of the tallest peaks between the Himalayas and New Guinea. Kinabalu sat at the eastern edge of ancient Sundu land, one of the high points that stayed dry even when the lowland plains around it were swallowed by rising seas. And because it never went under, and because it kept rising in isolation for millions of years, it became something else entirely, an evolutionary island in the sky. Kinabalu's slopes are home to more than 5,000 plant species, many found nowhere else on Earth, including carnivorous pitcher plants large enough to trap small rodents. Isolation does that. Give life enough time on a piece of land that nothing else can easily reach, and it stops resembling anything else on the planet. So Kinabalu is proof that some of Sunda land survived. But survival on the surface is only half the story, because underneath that same region of Borneo, there's a version of surviving Sunda land that's even harder to believe. A network of caves so vast that scientists still haven't finished measuring all of it. Fact 7. The largest empty space on Earth is underground here, in the rainforest of Gunung Mulu National Park in Sarawak. There's a cave chamber called the Sarawak Chamber. It is, by measured volume, the largest known underground chamber on the planet. To give you a sense of scale, the Sarawak Chamber is large enough to comfortably fit 40 Boeing 747 aircraft, parked wingtip to wingtip with room to spare. It's roughly 700 meters long, 400 meters wide, and in places over 70 meters tall. Tall enough that if you stood at one end with a powerful flashlight, the beam still wouldn't reach the far wall. It wasn't even discovered until 1981. And it wasn't fully surveyed until years after that, because the passage leading into it is a brutal flooded crawl that cave divers had to force their way through. There are almost certainly chambers of comparable scale still undiscovered elsewhere in the Mulu system. This isn't a cave, it's a cave network, with hundreds of kilometers of passages mapped so far, and geologists suspecting there's more out there than anyone has found. Mulu also contains Deer Cave, home to one of the largest cave passages by volume in the world, and to somewhere between 1 and 3 million wrinkle-lipped bats, which stream out of the cave entrance at dusk in a rippling black column that can take upwards of 45 minutes to fully empty. Why here? Limestone. Millions of years ago, this part of Borneo sat beneath a shallow tropical sea, the same broad shelf that would later become Sunda land, and the remains of marine organisms built up into thick beds of limestone rock. When the land later rose above sea level, tropical rain, which is naturally slightly acidic, went to work on that limestone for millions of years, slowly dissolving out one of the largest cave systems on the planet. So this is another piece of the same story. The rock that makes Mulu's caves possible was laid down in the same ancient marine environment that shaped Sundu land's foundations. The lost continent isn't just a memory of dry land that vanished. It's also the reason some of the strangest hollow spaces on Earth exist underneath the land that remained. And if the ground beneath Borneo hides emptiness on that scale, what about what's growing on top of it? Because the forest covering this island isn't just old. It might be one of the oldest continuously surviving ecosystems anywhere on the planet. Fact 6. A rainforest. Older than the Amazon. Ask most people to name the world's oldest rainforest, and they'll say the Amazon. It's a reasonable guess. It's the biggest, most famous rainforest on Earth. It's also wrong. The rainforests of Borneo and peninsular Malaysia are estimated to be around 130 million years old, making them substantially older than the Amazon, which in its current form is generally dated to somewhere between 55 and 10 million years old. Malaysia's forests were already established, complex ecosystems while dinosaurs were still the dominant life on Earth. They watched the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period happen from the other side of the planet, and kept growing afterward. That kind of longevity does something specific to an ecosystem. It lets evolution run for an extraordinarily long time without a hard reset. Malaysia's rainforests were never scraped flat by an ice sheet, the way much of North America and Europe was during the last glaciation. They persisted, generation after generation of the same lineages, layering complexity on top of complexity for tens of millions of years. The result is staggering biodiversity. A single hectare of Malaysian rainforest can contain more tree species than the whole of North America. The forests are home to orangutans, clouded leopards, pygmy elephants, and the world's largest flower, Rafflesia. Rafflesia is a parasitic plant whose blooms can reach over a meter across and which spends most of its life invisible. Hidden inside the vine, it parasitizes before erupting into a single, short-lived, famously foul-smelling flower. And this ties directly back to Sunda land, because these forests are exactly why the flooding of that landmass mattered so much biologically. When the plains connecting Malaysia to Sumatra and Java went under the sea, they didn't just separate landmasses, they split rainforest ecosystems and the populations living inside them into isolated fragments, each one left to evolve on its own from that point forward. Orangutans in Borneo and orangutans in Sumatra are different species today, specifically because Sunda land flooded and cut their ancestors off from each other. The lost continent didn't just disappear. It reshaped the tree of life on its way out. Fact 5. The island marooned in open ocean. Roughly 300 kilometers off the coast of Sabah, in the middle of the South China Sea, there's a tiny coral atoll called Layang Layang. It's Malaysian territory, and it might be one of the most isolated pieces of land the country controls. A thin, boomerang-shaped ring of coral sand, barely large enough to hold an airstrip, surrounded on all sides by water so deep it drops away almost immediately beyond the reef. What makes Layang Layang genuinely strange isn't its size. It's what's underneath it. The atoll sits on top of a seamount, an underwater mountain rising from the ocean floor, that plunges more than 2,000 meters straight down before it hits the true seabed. Coral has been growing on top of that submerged peak for so long that it's built up into an atoll, following the seamount's shape upward, always growing toward the surface as the ancient volcanic or tectonic structure beneath it slowly subsided over millions of years. It has no direct relationship to Sunda land's dry land history. Layang Layang was never part of the exposed shelf. It was always out here, isolated, a lonely outpost surrounded by deep ocean, even during the Ice Age's lowest sea levels. And that's exactly what makes it valuable as a contrast. Not everything about Malaysia's geography traces back to the lost continent. Some of it is a reminder of just how much deep ocean has always existed right alongside that shallow, once exposed shelf. Two completely different kinds of seafloor, sitting practically next to each other, one that can turn into dry land when sea levels drop, and one that never could, no matter how much ice built up on the poles. Today, Layang Layang's surrounding reef walls, dropping vertically for hundreds of meters into blue water, have made it one of the most sought-after diving destinations in the world. Divers come specifically to swim along a wall where, on one side, there's a shallow tropical lagoon, and on the other, nothing but open ocean falling away into darkness. Which brings up something worth asking. If Malaysia has land this remote, this isolated, sitting hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coastline, what does that do to the maritime borders of a country that's already split into two halves by the sea? Fact 4. One of the most important choke points on Earth. Between peninsular Malaysia and the Indonesian island of Sumatra runs a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Maluku. At its narrowest point, the Phillips Channel near Singapore, it's barely 2.5 kilometers wide, and through that narrow gap passes roughly a quarter of all the goods shipped by sea on Earth. Somewhere between 80 and 90,000 vessels move through the strait every year. an estimated 40% of global trade, and a similarly enormous share of the world's seaborne oil shipments, all funneled through a channel narrow enough that, from the deck of a large tanker, you can often see both coastlines at once. This bottleneck exists for the same geological reason Malaysia is split into two halves in the first place. The Strait of Malacca sits on the western edge of the old Sunda Shelf, shallow water, in places under 30 meters deep, exactly the kind of seafloor that used to be dry land during the Ice Age. If sea levels dropped low enough today, the way they did 20,000 years ago, ships wouldn't be sailing through the Strait of Malacca at all. They'd be looking at solid ground. That shallow depth is a double-edged sword. It's part of why the strait has historically been so easy to navigate close to shore, which made it one of the great trade highways of the ancient world, linking India, the Middle East, and China for over 1,000 years and turning cities like Malacca into wealthy trading ports. But it's also a hazard. Those same shallow waters, combined with the sheer volume of traffic squeezing through such a narrow space, make the strait one of the most navigationally demanding shipping lanes on the planet. So this isn't just an economic fact bolted onto a geography documentary. The Strait of Malacca's shape, depth, and strategic importance are direct consequences of the same drowned landmass this whole story keeps circling back to. Now picture standing at the edge of that shallow shelf and looking out toward where the seafloor drops away. Because just beyond it, off the coast of Sabah, there's a piece of land that shouldn't really exist. An island rising almost 600 meters straight up from the deep ocean floor, built entirely by something alive. Fact 3. An island built entirely by living things. Sipadan, off the eastern coast of Sabah, is Malaysia's only oceanic island, meaning unlike almost every other island in the country, it didn't form from land connected to a continental shelf. It grew. Sipadan sits atop an extinct volcanic cone rising from the floor of the Seh Sea. That cone itself doesn't break the surface. What does break the surface is roughly 600 meters of solid limestone, built up entirely from the skeletons of coral polyps growing on top of the volcanic peak over hundreds of thousands of years. Layer after layer after layer, each generation of coral building on the calcified remains of the one before it. The result is one of the steepest, most dramatic diving walls on Earth. Step off Sipadan's beach and the seafloor drops almost immediately, plunging 600 meters down the flanks of that ancient volcano in what divers call the Wall. A sheer cliff of coral and rock disappearing into blue darkness, patrolled by schools of barracuda that form into slowly rotating tornado-shaped columns, along with green turtles that use the island's beaches and reef ledges as nesting and resting sites, and hawksbill turtles that use the same sites. Sipadan is a useful contrast to nearly everything else in this list. It has nothing to do with the shallow Sunda Shelf, nothing to do with dry land bridges or Ice Age coastlines. It formed in deep water, far from where Sunda land ever reached. And that's the point. Malaysia's geography isn't a single story with one explanation. Some of that land drowned, some of it rose, and some of it, like Sipadan, was quite literally built from nothing but limestone, secreted by billions of tiny animals, one generation at a time for the better part of 500,000 years. Which raises one more question about borders, because if geography here can be this unpredictable, what happens when a national boundary runs straight through land that was never meant to be divided in the first place? Fact 2. The country that accidentally split another country in two. Here's a genuinely strange one. The nation of Brunei, a small, oil-wealthy sultanate on the island of Borneo, is not one continuous piece of territory. It's two. Brunei is split into two separate, non-contiguous parts by a wedge of Malaysian land, the Lembang district, part of Sarawak. It cuts straight through what would otherwise be a single, unified country. To travel by land from one half of Brunei to the other, you have to leave Brunei entirely, cross into Malaysia, drive through Lembang, and cross back into Brunei on the other side. The reason traces back to colonial-era land deals in the late 19th century, when the district of Limbang was ceded to the White Rajas of Sarawak, the British Brooke family who ruled the territory at the time, cutting Brunei's coastal sultanate cleanly in half. Brunei has, at various points since gaining independence, formally disputed the transfer, and the two nations only fully resolved their outstanding land and maritime boundary questions through negotiations completed in the early 2000s. What makes this relevant to the bigger story isn't the politics. It's what it reveals about how artificial the modern map of this region really is. Malaysia's two halves are separated by the sea because Sundu land drowned. Brunei is separated into two halves because of a border drawn during the colonial partitioning of a landmass that, 10,000 years earlier, wasn't divided by anyone or anything. It was one continuous piece of Sunda land's eastern edge. Every layer of this region's geography, from the deepest tectonic history down to the paperwork of 19th century treaties, keeps circling back to the same theme. Land that was once whole, split apart by forces both natural and human. And that brings the story to its final,